Turkiye has the second largest army in NATO behind the United States, and its defence industry is booming. What can other NATO countries learn from Turkiye? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Turkiye celebrated its Democracy and National Unity Day this week, marking 9 years since it overcame an attempted coup. Since then, Turkiye has built up its defence capability, becoming a significant player in the global drone market. As European countries look to rearm and fulfil NATO's 5% spend, what insights can they gain from Turkiye's example?
At last month's NATO summit, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan backed the decision for countries to increase their defence spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. It followed months of pressure from Donald Trump, who believed other countries weren't contributing enough. President Erdogan has been committed to ensuring Turkiye's defence becomes one of the most powerful among NATO nations. It has NATO's second largest army and is now a notable weapons exporter. Defence exports have risen to $7.1 billion in 2024, from $5.5 billion the previous year. This makes up 1.7% of global arms sales. Major buyers include the US, Italy, Czechia, Romania and Poland. Today, thousands of Turkish defence manufacturers span land, air and naval capabilities, which is being recognised internationally. 9 years ago, the Turkish people successfully protected the country from an attempted coup orchestrated by the terrorist organisation FETÖ. Ever since, President Erdogan has ensured the country's defence has been ramped up to protect the country from any outside influence. With Turkiye's ever-increasing and expanding defence industry, how can other NATO nations learn and benefit from this strategy?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Istanbul in Turkey is Matthew Bryza. He's a former American ambassador to Azerbaijan. Also in Istanbul, we have the political analyst Onur Erim. And from Washington, D.C. in the United States, we have Michael Ryan. He's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for European and NATO policy. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Matthew, to you, first of all, the numbers here are very impressive. Defence is now worth, what, $7 billion a year to the Turkish economy. These are big numbers on exports.
Yeah, they're huge, and that's an increase of about 400% over just a decade. So Turkey has developed a world-class arms industry now across all sectors. I mean, from fighter aircraft and helicopters to armored vehicles to electronics, electronic warfare, and this was all part of a long process, though, that began way back when in 1974, when Turkey intervened on the island of Cyprus to protect Turkish Cypriots and faced an embargo from the United States. So at that point, Turkey had decided it was going to pursue a domestic arms industry. And that whole effort accelerated again in 2004 when President Erdogan, well, then Prime Minister Erdogan, decided that Turkey should try to be as self-sufficient as possible and develop a defense export industry, which you just mentioned. And now, as of today, Turkey produces about, I think it's about 80% of the military hardware that it consumes.
Thanks, Matthew. Onur, to you. Clearly, there's a lot of thought and a clever strategy behind this. This has been a big success for Turkey.
And it has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears getting here. As Matthew said, it's definitely with the big support from the executive power, then the Prime Minister, now the President Erdogan. And it has a lot of reasons for this. And first and foremost, of course, the embargoes starting in the 70s that Turkey had to face. And I think we have a very old saying in Turkey. It goes something to the effect of a bad homeowner makes you a great new homeowner as a tenant. So if that translates well, Turkey is actually able to now cover more than 80% of military hardware to be self-sufficient, but it's still got some way to go.
Mike, to you, one person who has shaped a lot of what Europe is doing at the moment on defense is President Trump telling people that they need to be spending 5% of GDP on the defense of their countries, all these NATO members. This is very good news for countries with serious defense capabilities like Turkey.
Yes, it absolutely is, for many reasons. First of all, Turkey has the second largest military in NATO and the largest land army in Europe, and it sits in a very strategic location. So Turkey has always had a formidable military capability. Recall that Turkey and Greece came into the alliance together because each of them see each other in a somewhat different light than most allies see one another. But certainly it's an anchor to the alliance in Southeastern Europe. It's an anchor because of its formidable military capabilities, and with its increasing capability with defense industries, it can be a real player as Europe spends more on defense.
Matthew, to you, President Trump's comments about Europe having a free ride, European countries, we've seen the messages are freeloaders when it comes to defense. He's really kind of sharpened people's brains about spending on defense. That really has to be good news, hasn't it, for Turkey and all the defense companies looking to sell their arms across the continent?
It sure should be a good thing for those high quality Turkish defense manufacturing. And in my own interactions in Brussels and in European capitals, I hear an increasing appreciation of the quality and the cost effectiveness by comparison with U.S. and other weapons that Turkish production brings to Europe. We're at a moment where European leaders are, number one, defense leaders are warning that Europe needs to scale up its defense very quickly because they expect Russia to be ready to attack a NATO member state, probably in the Baltic states, they speculate, within 5 years. And many ministers of defense and chiefs of defense of European NATO member states say they believe Russia has the intention. So on the one hand, there's this preparation by Russia to challenge NATO's resolve to resist a Russian attack. And then number two, there's President Trump not only calling for NATO member states to end their freeloading, which they're, by the way, they're doing a great job of. I mean, they're now increasing their spending, as we saw at the last NATO summit, up to a goal of 5%. I mean, 3.5% increase in actual military hardware expenditures, and another 1.5% on related infrastructure. But the other point is that the United States, under President Trump, has frightened the Europeans into thinking the U.S. is going to withdraw a lot of its military capabilities. And there are some of those that only the U.S. can provide. So far, a lot of the space-based assets, a lot of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, air refueling. The good news for Turkey is that it has some companies here that are developing new satellite-based sensors, as well as the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. So the key then is for the Turkish state and the Turkish companies in their negotiations to build a climate of trust with the European consumers or the European defense companies, because if the Turkish companies do build such partnerships with EU member states that are in NATO, then Turkey can benefit from a lot of money that the EU is now allocating to help it scale up its defense capabilities.
Thanks, Matthew. So, Onur, that figure we quoted earlier on of $7 billion a year of exports, it's only going to go up, isn't it? If the whole of NATO, all the European members are suddenly rearming and spending more money, presumably that is going to be a positive for Turkey.
Yes, the entire industry and Turkey's production aims in parallel are moving more and more towards more technology side of things. As this develops, I think the levels of the amounts of exports in dollars and cents will go up trigonometrically for sure, because maybe as most exports are valued in kilogram wise, we will be selling the same kilogram of goods. However, we'll be selling more value added, more technologically savvy products, which will more than double, maybe triple in the next few years our export levels to upwards of maybe $50 to $60 billion very easily.
Mike, to you, we've seen the war in Ukraine. Drone warfare has changed everything, hasn't it? And it's fascinating to note that there is one Turkish product on the market, the Bayraktar TB2, the most widely purchased Turkish drone. Just talk to me about why that is so popular? Is it the case that modern warfare has changed forever?
Well, Turkey was first across the line with the most effective drone, and it was an opportune time after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And therefore, there was a great opportunity for Turkey to highlight this drone and for the Ukrainians to use it quite innovatively. But there is no such thing as one game changer that lasts forever. And so we see how counter drone warfare is becoming very effective. And it's now the number of drones that are produced, not necessarily the particular capabilities of any one drone. So Turkey has made a good reputation for itself. As Matt said, they're moving into electronic warfare and other areas of counter drone warfare, but also to enhance their own production capacity of their drones. Ukraine was a perfect time for them because, as we all know, President Erdogan tries to maintain a balanced role between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the European Union. Gaining more traction with European products in competition with Turkish products in Europe as Europe spends more is going to be as much of a political challenge as it is an industrial challenge because of the nature of the sometimes tense relationship between Europe and Turkey. Yeah. And also because Europe has been long seeking a European defense pillar within the European Union and to create a European common market for defense. So there's going to be a bit of a protectionist bent there. But as long as the conflict goes on in Ukraine and Turkey keeps producing outstanding weaponry, I think they will be able to find a market in Europe for those products.
Thanks, Mike. Matthew, to you, while we're talking about Ukraine, clearly there have to be more peace talks at some point this year between Putin and Zelensky. Where does President Erdogan come in here in facilitating those talks, perhaps being directly involved, Turkiye as a peacemaker between the two nations?
Well, I mean, as we all know, President Erdogan has a strong track record in being able to build common ground between Ukraine and Russia. We saw that with the so-called grain deal, the Ukraine grain deal. And there's really nobody, I think, who could have brokered something like that other than President Erdogan. Not because I'm sitting here in Turkey and like this country, but because he maintained both an open line to President Putin and didn't apply sanctions on Russia. Something that upsets and aggravates a lot of us in the rest of NATO land. On the other hand, it enabled the channel of communication to continue. And at the same time, President Erdogan and Turkey have unambiguously supported Ukraine's territorial integrity from the very start of Russia's both of their invasions of Ukraine, 2014 and 2022. And there's strong defense cooperation. Mike was talking about the TB2 drones a moment ago. But Turkey and Ukraine have agreements to build stealth-capable frigates for Ukraine and other military capabilities. But having said that, I am not convinced there are going to be peace talks anytime this year. I don't think President Putin wants to stop the war, and I don't think he can. His entire economy is now on a war footing, and he hasn't achieved any of the goals, his extreme goals that he's demanded, such as NATO pullback from Eastern Europe or the incorporation of 4 regions of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. So I think he's going to try to keep on fighting, and we'll see how the tug and push and pull with President Trump goes. But in any case, once we get to the point of peace talks, which will come, every war ends with a negotiation, then I think President Erdogan could be an interlocutor and mediator.
Onur, to you, while we're talking about NATO, from a Turkish perspective, how important is that role in NATO, the second biggest military in the organization? And you know, the kind of confidence that gives other powers knowing that Turkey is such a reliable partner?
I think it has a significant role for Turkiye. And let's not forget, it's actually one of the most major, I guess, well, definitely the most major military, but most major international organizations that the young Turkish Republic was a part of in the very, early years of the new republic. However, I think everybody's asking each other the same question. There was a philosophy behind the incorporation of NATO. However, in the last decade or so, now everybody, including the members, including the leading NATO founder, USA, is actually questioning what the new philosophy is or what the new philosophy should be. And I think there's still some level of confusion as to what will lead NATO as an ideology, as a philosophy for next years to come, for it to exist, as there was a number of leaders questioning the mere existence of NATO or why it's around. However, for Turkey, I grew up in a generation that was very NATO strong. It made us feel like part of the Western civilization for sure. It was the most solid, international allegiance Turkey was part of, as we were taught growing up in Turkey. However, as I said, in the years coming, we need to know what NATO's philosophy will be and what it actually will stand for.
Well, let's put that question to Mike Ryan. Mike, what is NATO's philosophy going forward now?
It's a great question. There's been a constant debate on this for the last 75 years, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to address it. First and foremost, the value of NATO is that it exists. 32 nations come together every day at the highest levels of government to consult with one another, to develop a shared perspective on the collective challenges that we all face, and to posture the capability to do something about those challenges when we agree collectively by consensus to do so. If we had to address a crisis and there was no NATO, how would we do it? We couldn't do it. And so the first thing we have to understand is the value of NATO is that it exists, and it sits with 35 or more partners, both partner nations and partner international organizations like the European Union and the UN. So NATO gets about its business every day, and its vision really is peace, and it's building world peace from the ground up through these partnerships and through these outreach to other regions. We have Asia Pacific partners now who've come to their third summit in a row. And we see very solid support for Ukraine, despite the political transience in every country during election cycles. We see President Trump, who's always been a big fan of NATO. He was just never a fan of NATO that couldn't fulfill its commitments. And so we see finally at the Hague summit that all allies have stepped up to 3.5% of their GDP on defense, with another 1.5% on security that supports the alliance goals and missions. And I would refer anybody that has questions to the summit communiques for the last 3 years and the NATO strategic concept, which was put forward by consensus in 2022, that clearly lays out the purposes of the alliance and the challenges that we face collectively, which includes the Asia-Pacific region.
Michael, just to follow up on this, in your time at NATO, give me your impression of Turkiye as a member of the organization. How reliable have they been?
Turkey is a model because they meet their commitments. They fulfill their responsibilities. When it's time to go do something difficult, Turkey is always in the front rank with the United States. And so that's important to remember. They know the rules of the alliance. They know that as a NATO ally, they're due certain prerogatives, and they insist on those. Their diplomats are extremely well trained and well educated and very articulate. And so when you sit down to negotiate with Turkish diplomats around a NATO table, and Turkey has something they want to get because it's their due, not because they're asking for anything that they're not due, it can be a very long and difficult negotiation. And we saw this with the accession of Finland and Sweden to the alliance. Turkey is going to fulfill their commitments. There's no doubt about that. But it's going to be a process, and they're going to take their pound of flesh, as we say in the United States.
Thanks, Mike. Matthew, to you, looking at domestic defence projects, there is an ambition to build a steel dome across Turkey in terms of air defence. That's a big ambition in the coming years.
It's a huge one. I mean, President Trump has talked about doing the same thing in the United States, and Israel has been quite effective at doing so, but it's a very small territory that it has to defend, and it had massive support from the United States. So for Turkey to do that on its own, that's an extremely tall challenge. If you can do it, then it's great. I mean, Turkey has had problems procuring air defense systems. It had debates and tough negotiations, as Mike was talking about, with NATO and with the United States to try to obtain Patriot air defense systems, and ended up opting for the Russian S-400. So if it could put in place an Iron Dome equivalent, more power to it. But that will require an enormous amount of money and all kinds of additional capabilities that Turkey has not yet developed on its own. So it would need to be a collaborative effort with NATO allies.
Thanks, Matthew. Onur, to you. We've seen other countries in NATO, like Italy, who I believe spend 1.49% of GDP, nowhere near what they should be spending on defence. The Italians are now looking at building a bridge from Sicily to the mainland and classing that as defence spend. Turkey is looking at building a steel dome. Like, this is actual money spent on proper defense projects. Again, as Mike said earlier on, a model member of NATO.
Well, I think in the last 5 to 10 years, countries have been actually. It's the first time countries are actually spending or decided to spend a lot of money since probably the end of World War II, with the exception of the Cold War era between U.S. and Russia. This is going to happen. I think the importance of countries, those that are capable to a level, to a degree that they're capable of, trying to develop their indigenous products that they think is important to them, is also, giving these budgets a big hike all across the board. And we have actually countries like, well, mostly, if not at all, totally, like USA to thank for that. Like, if it wasn't for the US and their lack of keeping their word in cases like F-35s, Turkey would have probably not anytime soon decide to spend this much money in defense. But again, thanks to the administrations in the past, especially in the U.S., where we have decided, the country has decided, and it has a full support. This is not just a political or a politician decision. It has the support of the whole country. Decided to try to do everything that's imperative on their own, and this is actually catching around, I think, to every single country to a degree. Whatever they can, whatever they have to, they can. Turkey has an ambitious aim, to a goal to build an Iron Dome. Don't forget, it's a multi level and a multi spectrum process. You have to have more than several different items working together to put this thing, and they all have to work perfectly. And as Matthew said, this may not, Turkey doesn't have the absolute right now necessary items to put these together, but it could always exchange. And I think Italy's interest in Turkish products in the last year or so, especially to Baykar, is now showing more interest, is going to probably a good indication that will show quite a number of European companies, especially those that are state backed, to be more collaborative with Turkish companies who seem to be leading the way in many different areas, not just unmanned vehicles.
Thanks, Onur. Mike, to you, in your experience, what lessons do you think some of the newer members of NATO, like Finland and Sweden, as you mentioned, could learn from seasoned veterans like Turkiye?
Well, the first lesson I would draw is stand up for yourself. And Turkey is always very good at that. But at the same time, when the going gets tough and the tough get going, be amongst the tough. And you can count on Sweden and Finland to be there for certain. There's a lot of similarities between the Scandinavians' approach to total security and total defense as there are to Turkey. And so at both ends of the alliance, and it's because of their geostrategic positions, that they really understand the value of national security and of collective security. And they're willing to stand up on their own if they have to. And the Finns and the Swedes have been doing this for a long time. And now that they're in a collective defense organization, they're setting the example of how to do so. So I would put Finland, Sweden, and Turkey very much at the forefront of NATO members who are capable, who are committed, and who are reliable, and who will spend what's needed for the entire NATO alliance, not just for their own nations, in order for the group to succeed. And so I think they both are cut from the same cloth, they're Enders.
Matthew, final point to you. I guess we live in a very interesting world, and you learn who your friends are. NATO and Turkey, very, very tightly interwoven relationship.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, for decades, NATO depended on Turkey to defend NATO's southern flank. The Cold War ended, and then Turkey came up with a different level of importance in terms of its geography, with Syria to the south, with Russia, Ukraine to the north, with Azerbaijan and Armenia at war to the east, and with Turkish troops on the ground as peacekeepers and observers in Azerbaijan after the Second Karabakh War. To me, That was a very advantageous moment for NATO because those became NATO's eyes and ears on the ground in the middle of a conflict that would otherwise have been dominated by Russia and its peacekeepers. And I think often NATO overlooks those sorts of unusual contributions that Turkey can make to the entire alliance, just as it was Turkish forces, drones, and standoff artillery that actually confronted and fought Russian troops and Assad's troops in Idlib province back in 2019, I think it was, when Russia violated the safe area for the Syrian refugees. So Turkey has all sorts of capabilities it brings to the table for NATO. And I hope that some of the political tensions Mike alluded to between Turkey and European member states of NATO can be managed as those European member states more deeply embrace all the capabilities that Turkey is bringing to the table.
Matthew, thank you, and to Onur and Mike as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.